Hello, and welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. My name is Bruce Gemmel. I'm a draftsman and a researcher in architecture. And this is a series of ruminations I do based under the heading of the realm of ideas is free to all. And this is episode 28, Entanglement and Conditioning 2. This is a continuation of last week's topic, which actually turned out to be a little bit more involved than I think I initially gave it credit for. So what are we doing? I started this project, I think this iteration was started in December 24 with the operation of the metaphor as the first topic. What happened was there was a series of projects I had done. One was a potential book project. And then there was another series of videos that I had done. And then what happened was I ended up that I kind of found a platform that was better suited for me to do the work that I had done. I think, 26 episodes on that platform. And then I just felt as if it was better to kind of leave that platform. So it came over here. I found this platform to be much more agreeable as a place to kind of work. Anyway, so we started with my basic principles of how I got to my particular beliefs and attitudes on architecture and the idea of generative strategies, and then kind of started from there. So quick breakdown was the first thing I started to talk about is what I call the operation of the metaphor. And then I broke that into three different categories: the organic metaphor, the artificial and aesthetic metaphor, and the third one, the unbreakable bonds, or the proto-metaphor. So basically I talked about natural, artificial, and kind of like, I guess we could call them social. I talked about the fact that I believe that there is an inherent operation that exists as a process in nature that can be reflected in artificial and social constructs. Now, I don't use that construct in the kind of postmodern sense. I think that's gibberish. But anyway, the point is, I believe that what we see in what we would call the aesthetic metaphor is just a kind of reflection of what exists in nature. And that's kind of something I'll talk about a little bit with the idea of entanglement, because I believe in the fact that like the accretion and complexity that comes from simplicity is not a coincidence. It's something that happens. It's something we can observe, and it's something that inherently kind of gives us a different condition on the way in which we proceed. So talked about that. Then after that, I talked about the idea of criticism, which again, I thought was a very fundamental idea. And I talked about the idea of criticism, necessity of criticism. I talked about the art of finding what needs to be said, and then the view of criticism and indictment of societal health. And then I realized that what I was doing was seeing that there's certain unbreakable bonds, as I call them, which is what the societal metaphor is, are kind of things that exist in a sense where there are operations that are discovered that have consequence, and we use these things to kind of chart us. I referred to Ortega Gasset's Revolt of the Masses. I talked about Alfred North Whitehead's Adventures and Ideas, and kind of talked about the idea that there were certain things that seemed to kind of be valuable or consequential in the way in which we constructed ideas. Then I talked about my specific ideas of architecture. I talked to architecture as a verb, which I now come to see architecture as a process or a series of kind of interrelated processes. Talked about drawing as a kind of like as a perspective of how in which one could kind of not only identify but can generate strategy as not only as a kind of point of view but also as a generative strategy. Then I talked about towards an organic architecture was basically kind of like my particular interest in what we do. So then after that, there was authority of ideas, my past architecture. Authority of ideas was there to kind of talk about the idea of the necessity of an architect to basically premise what he does with the way in which the intent of which it is he does. Went through my past architecture, the specifics, then we went back to this idea of indicators of societal health, because I realized that idea of these unbreakable bonds, which was something we talked about, which is also related to a lot of the things. I realized that was a kind of a core idea behind a lot of the things. So talked about that for a while. Then we talked about the idea of power, rule, persuasion, tradition, and culture. And then the last things I talked about was the idea of love, beauty, and truth. Basically taking this idea and kind of seeing it through the lens of kind of like Whitehead's Adventures and Ideas in his last chapter, where he talks about truth, beauty, peace. Let's see, what were they? It was like truth, beauty, adventure, art, and peace. And peace was an interesting thing because he talked about the idea of kind of like fine fine actions, which I would kind of say is kind of somewhat related to what I would call decency, or kind of like self-regulation. So then what happened was I went to that, and that kind of completed the original group of 26 videos. Then last week I started with a new group, which was basically going back into the kind of nature of the work in which I do now, which I'll basically kind of be showing in the upcoming weeks, and kind of, but I wanted to kind of give a premise of how in which these things go. And I found that even though I kind of wanted to make sure that the first group was to kind of follow the same format and same order, I thought to myself, there's no need to kind of mess it up. Let's just do it, and then we'll go from there. So now we're into what I call entanglement and conditioning. So with entanglement and conditioning, there's two parts of what I see in my work. One, which I would say is the kind of one with organic aspirations, which is what I kind of think I've made clear is like, I believe that organic architecture is a truly possible, literal thing, and is something that I kind of work towards. And I've kind of found as if my work over the years has taken two particular stances. I mean, I do have an affection and an affinity for the kind of like mechanistic, inorganic, artificial architecture, because that's basically where I started out, But I do find that over the time, I've come to see the potential of just a greater, more sensual nature of organic work. So that's kind of explaining the two different places. So last week we started talking about that organic, what I would call an organic ontology, or, as organisms. And that will be what we'll talk about again tonight. And then next week we'll talk about the inorganic, or the aspect of a kind of like, let's see, what I would call it would be, the kind of artificial. But before that, we were going to go into this my favorite segment, which is This Week in Julie. And Julie's going to tell us where she is in terms of her work, and then basically tell us a little bit about what particular piece we're going to kind of focus on as a part of our topic for discussion of the continuation of last week's conversation about entanglement and conditioning.
Okay, I will bring it.
Yes. So just to quickly go over it, entanglement is a word that I use to talk about the way in which the metaphor kind of like accretes.
You haven't seen this in a while.
No, I know. I love this piece. So what does this have to do with This Week in Julie?
Everything.
Okay. Because, I mean, this might pertain to the topic, right?
It pertains to the topic.
Okay, so we're going to okay. Because what I want to do is like not only talk about what pertains to the topic, but also, hey, what did Julie do this week? Julie did this. She was on this review, or she did this, or she finished this drawing, or she finished this painting. I know that you finished a painting, and I know you finished a drawing. So yeah, let's do that. Let's show what you've just completed. Let's see.
Should I do that first?
Yeah, because this is a topic for discussion. But I think everyone would love to see that incredible drawing with the spider.
Should I take it out of the bag? It's still in your bag.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, entanglement and conditioning were things that are kind of my own lexicon based on the things that I've kind of seen or read in other people's work. One of the things that's kind of coming up for us, and we'll kind of talk more in detail when it's actually kind of like put in stone, is that we'll be speaking with an architectural firm about the nature of, I guess, organic design thinking, or some of the aspects of generative strategies. And that's going to be exciting for us. So we'll kind of get a chance.
We've been asked to come and do a presentation.
Yeah.
We just don't have the date.
Yeah, we don't have the date yet. And again, we don't want to mention any firms or anything until we actually do it. In fact, maybe what we'll do is we'll try to get, maybe we can invite Robin if she wants to be on with us.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically entanglement is that potential once a space is conditioned. So if something is conditioned, there's the operation of kind of things that kind of coexist, but then they kind of come by what Lynn Margulis would call a symbiogenetic aspect that allows them to kind of create something beyond itself. An example would be a cell and a cell with a nucleus
Just here for a
to
minute.
kind of create like a
Okay.
eukaryotic life, or say the idea of the structure of carbon in its particular matrix and its
Okay.
ability to generate
Is that okay?
polypeptide chains and amino acids. Okay,
Mhm.
so let's see.
Can you hold it up?
Yes,
I'll talk
yes,
about.
okay.
Now there's a lot of graphite and a lot of pencil
Glare.
on here, and there might be a lot of shine and glare. You'll have to get it at a good angle.
There we
Maybe even closer is
Mhm.
better, I think. So you can go into the close-up.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a drawing I finished at the Met
Mm-hmm.
tonight, and is about the discovery of a macabre caterpillar called the bone collector caterpillar, one of, I think, only two highly carnivorous caterpillars. Most of the caterpillars known are strict vegetarian plants, but they certainly don't eat out meat, hunts, stalks, and kills prey. I think many times its size, and what this caterpillar does, which is rather incredible. Oh, that's pretty good. Is that it cohabitates and is in fact a commensal to particular types of spiders and only lives as they found it. I believe it exists in other places just because people haven't found it yet. I mean, it's a fairly small in terms of its size. It certainly wouldn't be very easy to spot, but lives on one island of Hawaii and is a commensal with a particular type or very few types of spiders, and not the spiders that make large planar webs out in the open, but those particular species of spiders that make these very clandestine, shaded, shadowy webs in crooks of trees and rotting logs, in the bowls of rocks, in between plants that are shaded, in areas that are very protected, in I would say in secret, very hidden realms, which is obviously where this. Can I have a sip? I'm so tired. Okay, hang on. I don't want to anywhere near this. Thank you. I don't want to splash on this. That would not be good. So, what is
Jasmine?
Yes. And we fully expect TST to sponsor us.
That'd be great.
It would actually be great.
Yeah.
We actually do drink enormous amount of organic teas tea. We drink it every single day.
My favorite is rose.
Yeah, Bruce's favorite is rose. My favorite is jasmine, but I love the mint green, especially when I can find it, especially in the summer.
It's very refreshing.
It's very refreshing. Yes, it is. Anyway, and the mint is hard to find because very few.
So what else have you done? I mean, you not only finished this, right, but you also finished your painting.
I did.
Yeah.
I was just going to make one really key point.
Take as long as you want.
About the architecture and the engineering and the genius that is the bone collector caterpillar. It is not just a collector of severed body parts from the spider's feast. And this is where I wish we could play our CD of Albert Roussel's The Spider's Banquet, which would be a phenomenal soundtrack to our discussion here, which we finally found on CD. And I'll give a plug to Academy Records on 18th Street, which is a great bunch of guys. Hi, John. And they have amazing stuff, and their CDs are great. And anyway, so this caterpillar shapes these severed body parts. So we are talking weevil heads, ant heads, fly wings, beetle legs. What?
I think that's in that magazine, that issue of Science right there. When we get it, we can show people.
It is?
That one right there on the
Oh.
on the couch.
Okay.
If we can bring it over, I'll hold it
Yeah.
up.
Okay.
Keep talking, though.
Well, I can't if I'm over there. No one's going to hear.
Yeah, they will.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, anyway, what I was going to say is that it literally whittles them down. It measures these body parts and fits them on its silk cocoon as it is in a metamorphic stage. So it crawls around on the web, eating the leavings of the spider, actively hunting anything that comes into the web that the spider doesn't eat first. And in fact, it let me go and get it, but I don't think anyone's going to hear me when I'm talking over here. I really don't. I mean,
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just hand it to me.
Here?
Keep talking.
Okay, I really
I'll
need
find
to
it.
sit. I'm incredibly
Yep.
tired. I can't keep jumping up.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is, it's not just a collector. There's another animal called the decorator crab that is also a mistress of peripatetic architecture, which I find fascinating. So architecture of an individual entity that is moving around in its own house, not a hermit crab, which is a fine example, but a hermit crab moves into, it was in the news of the week or the research.
Okay.
The hermit crab, simply occupies a shell of another sea creature. It doesn't, as far as I know, modify that shell in any way. It moves in, it wears this shell. What the bone collector caterpillar does is modify all of these components, like Tinker Toys or Legos, but actually even more. It isn't using factory made or prescribed parts. It cuts down a fly leg. It whittles away at a thorax of a beetle. I mean, it's incredible. And it fits them in very specific ways. This is it.
Mm-hmm.
This is the research article, but the initial pictures are in the news of the week, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I finished this drawing, and I have the adult moth that it eventually morphs into in place of part of the fin, which is the cover of the inkwell. And I created a life-size Trompe l'oeil, I don't know if you can see it, writing box, a Japanese writing box that is my own invention, because it's not a particular writing box. It's not in the collection of the Met, because sadly they do not have any writings currently on display in the Japanese wing, which they usually do. And on the cover of the box, which I have laid across, is a spider web, and it is decorated with the dew of the morning. So that is what is going on here. Bruce, would you like to say something?
Yeah. So I found this.
That's the research article.
Yeah, it basically shows an image of the moth and what it actually looks like when it's
Your
kind of
fingers
taken.
over the key part.
Okay. I can't really see because it's behind. We have
Yeah.
to, we'll find a way to kind of make it so we can put these images up.
I'm
I will.
sure he knows how to do that, where
Hopefully.
you just have an image.
You can
say,
see all
next
these
to you.
pieces that it's used to cover itself. So the caterpillar itself is pretty much completely obscure.
Yeah, you don't even see the caterpillar. I think that's the idea. It's created its own exoskeleton and a very fearsome, spiky, medieval mace-like armor.
Here's some of the pieces that it actually kind of uses.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, and there's kind of the pieces from which it comes from.
Yeah.
Right. So it's actually quite clear.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting because what happened was, most of what I would say in terms of your drawings are actually kind of like, there's this sense of a kind of infestation that kind of reveals itself. What I find so brilliant about your drawings and your paintings is there's initial kind of like calm, but there's a sense that there's something quite not right. And then upon closer examination, which is kind of like partially also a characteristic of yourself, is that like there's always this sense of like, oh, this is just another person. And then there's this sense of like, hey, there's something else going on here. And then as you approach and you get closer, you start to see these things and you think, oh, this is definitely a kind of like an investigation into a landscape that is far more intense, far more bewildering, far more disquieting than I had ever imagined. The difference here is it's very direct. And I think part of it might have been the macabre nature of the thing itself, but at the same time, I think that the immediacy of this piece is kind of unmistakable. I think there's this big central figure, but I kind of love this vanitas because, what happens in the vanitas is we see those precious objects, like in this case, the writing box, that is this kind of like beautiful artificial thing, highly crafted,
it's got gold,
right. And at the same time, it's now kind of being inhabited, infested, and kind of like
by something sinister,
and exactly, and digested.
Yeah, quite.
So I think that's kind of something that kind of very much fits in with the topic of the idea of the fact that like one of the things that I think needed to kind of be more clarified from last week is that in terms of the difference between the artificial or inorganic aspects of my work and the organic aspects is there's a different focus in terms of the fact that one of the terms that's used in terms of objects or organisms is a sense of homeostasis. But in terms of the process and the stability of a process, there's something called homeoresis, which is actually the trajectory. And I think in this case, one of the things that I think makes the difference is it's not just the question of, like, for instance, if an object, a mechanism is basically put away, you can take it out and it's pretty much ready to just kind of dust off and use again because it doesn't really have a lot of kind of processed, complex organic processes that have to be maintained. You can't shut an organism down. You can suspend it in ways through extreme cold and extreme conditions, and there are things that kind of live in suspended animation. But again, the conditions of suspended animation are not just kind of putting it in the attic. They're usually highly specialized. So that's, I think, one of the things that kind of come to mind here is the fact that the vanitas shows the fact that as that in spite of the fact that given a kind of like sense of repose, a mechanism can exist pretty much for a fairly long time because it doesn't have any processes that can break down. But at the same time, these things are all very delicate in terms of the fact they can very easily be consumed by organic life. So that was something that I think is a really kind of important kind of difference. So you want to tell us a little bit more about your painting, or you want to kind of maybe we should now, or what do you want to do? Do you want to talk about the piece that pertains to the topic, or do you want to talk? So are we moving from This Week in Julie to our topic discussion, or?
Well, I can say a few things more about This Week in Julie.
Yes.
I'll have a sip of tea.
Yes,
Boy,
okay.
am I tired. Get a long walk. Thank you. I mean, do it over here. So I also finished my painting that I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 months, called Janus Tales of Abisu, Adventures in Kupfercell Duality, where I talked about the dual nature of materials. And there had been a research article that almost no one seems to have seen, because I mentioned this to people and they've never even heard of a Kupfercell, but they are the resident macrophages in the liver that basically they're giant white blood cells that are your first guard against, a viral infection, a bacterial infection. They clean up your metabolic waste. They're absolutely essential. They're believed, if I'm not mistaken, more Kupffer cells than any other cell of this type in
Hmm.
your body. They, like I said, are the resident macrophage, or big white blood cell eaters. They eat all of the bad stuff that causes major health problems. So if your macrophages are not working properly, you have a huge problem. Anyway, they reside in the liver, and the research article just absolutely fascinating. And you can apply this to architecture, to engineering, to music. It's just really, really interesting. Is their location is everything. Their function is altered dramatically, as is their. You look confused.
No,
Oh.
not at all.
Oh,
I'm trying to think of correlating something. I was just talking
good.
about
Good.
thinking about the microhesal networks
Good.
and how to relate that to the idea of the fact that they actually live with the idea of the actual living within their food as a source.
It was just an expression of intense concentration.
Exactly.
I see.
No, because I'm trying to think about these things and kind of
sure.
pertain to the other things I
Oh,
want to talk
absolutely.
about.
Yeah, this is all connected
Mm-hmm.
in a giant mycelial network.
Mm-hmm.
So, depending on the location in the liver of the Kupffer cells, which are incredibly kinetic, they are dynamic. I can't even stress that. They morph constantly. They either cause inflammation throughout the human body or prevent and stop that same inflammation throughout the body, meaning they cause a degeneration or they prevent a degeneration. And as you probably know, body-wide inflammation is a cause of many, many, many very egregious human afflictions. I mean, inflammation causes all sorts of things, none of them good. So, a pro-inflammatory state, not good. Anti-inflammatory is good, not artificial ones, but actual ones.
Mm-hmm.
So, eat your salmon.
And there also is temporary
mushrooms.
benefits from inflammation in certain circumstances.
Well, if you're wounded.
No, exactly. So I'm just saying it's not as if like one is always good and one is always bad.
Not,
I mean, there's an idea to kind of moderate, because then that I think is much more in line with your thinking about ABSU. Because the thing is, ABSU also moderates between the idea of maintaining the ecosystem, but at the same time, kind of like understanding the fact that there is a cycle within this ecosystem that has to exist in terms of life and death in order to maintain the system itself.
Right, which is where ABSU comes in as a prevailing metaphor for the actions of the Kupffer cell, which is that ABSU, a really key figure in Japanese mythology. And I saw a special on NHK World, one of my favorite channels, all Japanese, all the time. There are some towns there was one that had like 900 statues of Abisu. So, I mean, he's very revered. This was a seaside town, a fishing town. I don't recall the name of the town, but I'm sure we could look it up. So, Abisu was both the protector of fish and ocean life and the destroyer of fish and ocean life, because he was the avatar of the fishermen who are hunting and eating and killing the fish and the ocean life. They are selling it, they are eating the fish. So, I mean, it is, it's a complex thing. I mean, yet also it's part of a network of hunting and replenishment. And
Okay.
Anyway,
all right, good. Yeah. So now let's take the topic, right, which is kind of entanglement and conditioning.
Yeah, you want to talk about
and
your topic?
let's
let's
discuss let's discuss that as pertains to you have this piece.
I do.
And we'll talk about that in relationship to, again, and this part is like a discussion where we kind of do a back and forth in terms of like, this piece as it pertains to the idea, and then the last is a wrap up of the idea and the next topic.
Sure.
Right.
I don't want to monopolize, so why don't you say some things?
Okay. Well, no, I don't really. I mean, it's been a while since we talked about this piece, so it's like
The title and subtitle is on the back. You can read it. It's on the back in the corner.
Okay, no, but just tell us about this.
Sure.
And then we'll kind of
Why don't you read it out?
Okay. Auditory of Ebi-Noether theorem in sense to ignite the Tenrec boys.
Yeah.
What are the Tenrec boys?
Okay. So the students, almost all male, I believe, because that's who was allowed to study math pretty much, were called Noether's boys. And Ebi-Noether was a mathematician, a brilliant one that almost no one has heard of now. And she worked unpaid for decades because she was a woman. She was from Germany, I believe, had to flee the country during World War II. She fled the Nazis. She settled in Bryn Mawr finally and died at about 50 or 51 of botched surgery on an ovarian tumor. It's just so tragic because, as we know now, it's never a good idea to have surgery on there, and they go away on their own. So the whole thing was so horrifying. And there's something called Noether's theorem that I believe is still a cornerstone of physics and mathematics now. She was a physicist too. She was primarily, I believe, a mathematician.
Yeah, I think she was. I mean, I believe Einstein referred to her, I think, admirably. He felt that she was a very important mathematician and she actually had solved some very important problems. So she certainly was somebody. But you chose her as the avatar for this piece because...
Well, because I was dealing with a fungal mycelium. I was dealing with network communication. So this entire painting addresses this. This is an organic network being used as a metaphor for an artificially constructed network. The communication through Ebi-Noether of her theorems, of her learning, and she just didn't have one. She was a font of mathematical ingenuity and innovation. I mean, I believe she was one of the finest minds ever. And I believe that's how Einstein.
I think Einstein said she was certainly the greatest female mathematician of her time. Thought she was a very prominent mathematical mind.
So because she died so young and so tragically, this painting is about the persistence and communication of her ideas up through the decades, through her students and then their students. And her boys, like the Lost Boys in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, were called Noether's boys. And they were a network of mathematicians, of like students who kept her work alive. And it exists to this day. And if it weren't for her students, I mean, she really, as far as I know, didn't have a lot of time to publish as much work as she would have liked. Nor, like I said, nor was she paid for decades. So, I mean, a lot of people never were even able to take her class or study with her.
So, okay. So you used the idea of the microhesal network to kind of basically show how these things come up through. Now, I remember there was a piece that was descending and then this as if it was kind of dropped. Yeah, I think what I remember about this now it kind of was that like you could see the surface, right, from which things had descended.
Yes,
and then you could see this, and at the same time coming up as the kind of object sinks were these kind of like vortices that kind of could rebound from that. And I thought was really kind of poignant was the fact that from this tragedy that kind of created itself, there was at least this energy that was allowed to kind of generate in the central area, and then kind of come to this kind of fruition up here in this area here, in this area. I can't. This is terrible because I can't even see what I'm pointing at.
I don't.
No,
I
can't. No, I do. But I'm saying like this piece here, right, is that piece that kind of was generated through these pieces as this piece descended. But as it descended, it kind of like let off this energy, and that I think that's kind of true of any, any professor. They kind of leave behind, the ideas,
legacy and
their their legacy is the students and the students' ideas that come from them. One of the things I always think is that when I look at a Wikipedia page on an individual, if it's a worthwhile individual, they'll kind of have a very clear idea of who influenced them, who they influenced, and who the students were. And then I always find that like one of the reasons why there's certain people who kind of like are limited or no consequences, that there really isn't any influence and there really wasn't any kind of like
go past them.
Right. But it also wasn't, it really wasn't generated from anywhere. There's a lot of people who are kind of just these isolated individuals who really don't have any kind of purposefulness. But to the idea now,
which
is that one of the things is that like my feeling is that the entanglements of the of processes and of pieces come about to create opportunities. And like I think I said last week, I'll refer to it again, is that in the Carl Sagan Cosmos, there's a piece somewhere in one of the videos where he does this kind of maybe 2 or 3 minute, if it's even that long, vignette where he shows a series of line drawings of how organisms basically started from a cell and then basically became life as we know it and became us. And it kind of shows this fact that at each motion, there's an entanglement caused by a conditioning. Now, these are my words. Conditioning is that opportunity that comes apart as a result of two things being in proximity. That conditioning forces or kind of gives the opportunity for entanglement. Even in terms of what Whitehead...
And reproduction.
Yes, exactly. One of the things that Whitehead, I think, talked about within the kind of like theological aspect is the fact that there is an imagination. And I mean, I believe there is an imagination in nature, in the fact that these things come about as a result of these opportunities. I mean, we have the idea of evolution, but we also have the idea from Lynn Margulis of symbiogenesis, where, things out of extreme circumstance will sometimes come to create the opportunity for things to be consumed, but not fully absorbed. And as a result, that opportunity exists for these things to kind of like come about. And I think she uses the example of some worms and some other kind of forms that had actually digested things, but had not completely absorbed it. And as a result, started to develop certain traits that were not collinear, meaning they weren't things that kind of developed.
It would have naturally.
Exactly. Developed. So it wasn't a mutation. It was in fact a kind of like an entanglement.
Contiguous evolution.
Exactly. So what happens is it was the opportunity of the environment that this situation kind of came about. And we kind of see that all the time, where certain things, like you were talking about, the pieces that come to be entangled with other pieces, they give up part of their own identity in order to coexist. I mean, the Kupfer cell has found a really valuable place for itself where it has food. So it basically says, I'm going to give up my own personal identity to become part of the liver. Probably has a lot of kind of like, cooperation and commensalism within the liver, but basically as a result has found a permanent food source. Just the same way that there are certain kind of like, organisms that live inside the gut of the termite that allow it to kind of absorb cellulose. This was not a mutation that all of a sudden that the termite evolved a gut bacteria. The gut bacteria came to live there as a result of the opportunity to absorb the cellulose, which was its food.
And if you actually wipe out the termite's gut bacteria, which they've done in lab experiments, they'll starve to death.
Yeah, because it becomes a different organism. Yeah.
They don't have any way
Exactly.
to digest. So
Exactly. So
some
that.
very key thing here, though,
Mhm.
is the title of this piece, which is why I brought it up,
Mm.
is Autochory of Eminurther. And I'd like to bring up the word autochory because it is exactly what we are talking about, which means the self-dispersal by plants of their seeds. And that's what autochory is.
Oh.
And there's active autochory, where plants literally shoot their seeds out explosively. They propel them.
That's projectiles.
They shoot them out like a cannon, and they shoot out with an incredible amount of force and speed. And there's also passive autochory, where the seeds are dispersed by the wind or in the feces of the animals that eats the plants. So the title of this painting, mine, is Autochory of Eminurther. So what it is this is my analysis of the dispersal pattern of the knowledge that she generated. That's what this is. And why the subtitle? Because a tenrec, the animal that occurs, it is a mammal, here has more offspring than any other mammal, as far as I know. They'll have like 30, 40, 50 little mammals at the same time. And this is a giant incense burner.
I remember that.
That's at the Met in the Southeast Asian wing, very ancient. I believe it is Indian. It's in the Southeast Asian wing. And how you disperse scents and incense, is your eye okay?
Yeah.
Through the air is very similar to the process of autochory. So, and how a fungus will shoot out its spores.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of think that, like, in terms of the particular, in terms of the particular aspect,
it shows up well, actually.
No, it does. You can kind of see the incense burner descending. You see
here.
the animal at the bottom,
and many of the tenrecs as they are entangled
but then you see,
in the mycelium.
Right, but then you see the network of the mycelium.
Yeah.
And then once it gets back to the surface, you see the flowering mushrooms.
The fruiting bodies,
of the mushrooms.
The mushrooms,
Yeah.
I thought it was very appropriate.
Yeah, so like the thing is, when you drop an object into the water, usually the water kind of like, gives you kind of like, you see the water come back up. In this case, what comes forth is the shape of the water kind of splashing as actually fruiting bodies of the mushrooms.
And you were instrumental in inspiring me to research the splash patterns of things when they hit the water. And that's what I used as a reference, or the actual splash patterns of things that hit the surface of the water, and what the dispersal pattern of the waves looks like.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I think that this was a very successful, I mean, you don't have any unsuccessful paintings, but this was incredibly successful in terms of its kind of like, it has a kind of intimacy, in terms of its kind of surreal juxtapositions. I think sometimes, one of the things I always felt that was kind of a weakness in a lot of the surrealist painters was that there was a tendency to have a typical kind of weirdness. Whereas I think that, the idea of juxtaposition doesn't have to be just weird or just kind of odd.
No, it doesn't.
There's kind of like weird. There's other aspects to it. I think there's a kind of intricacy and a complexity in the way this piece kind of comes about in the fact that you actually see the splashes of water actually as kind of like fruiting bodies of the mushroom. And I think, let me kind of see if we can.
Sure, it actually shows up pretty well on the screen.
Yeah, because I mean, you see you can see that light blue line that indicates the kind of surface of the water, but then you actually see these pieces coming up almost as if like a mushroom that kind of comes across the forest floor. But this, in the case, is being propelled as it kind of becomes the water that comes back, as the rush of the the water that's displaced by the object sinking into it.
Mhm.
I
Yeah, and
think
it's
is really
one
quite
actually,
beautiful.
thank you, that we haven't actually looked at in a while. And this
No.
painting, unlike some of my others, has never been published. So no one has ever seen it.
True.
My other paintings, a number of which have, this one has not.
Right,
So
right.
it's a rarity.
So in this case,
Yeah.
what happens is, like I said, entanglement is that sense where the things come together to form. In the case of, like, the metaphor is the operation where things come, they become entangled, and they come about to become useful, and we identify them and we identify their value. But the conditioning of which is the kind of situation of the environment. So in my work, what I'm trying to do in the organic case is like what I would call organic ontologies as organisms. Now, I am not capable of generating organisms. I'm not God, and so at the same time, it's like I'm trying to kind of maybe generate unisons of organic circumstance that can become an environment for humans. So the idea is it's kind of like a conditioning of the potential for us to live within the context of a completely organic system. Now, we've seen this in fantasies, in science fiction, and things like that, but I think the reality is this is a potential for us, and I mean, people use these words because I think they're not really capable of the total vision to come up with a better word. But I mean, one of the things I said is like a truly organic architecture is a solution to sustainability because it basically is ultimately its own thing. It's its own process. And, one of the things we're talking about today was the idea that the fungal network kind of like basically lives within its own food in the fact that it has this ability to have its own profile. I mean, that's what you were saying.
Yes, and if I may, and it's too bad I built a giant altar to you. Now I don't know if I have to take it down. When you said you aren't God, I said I built a giant altar.
Oh, okay, cool.
So the mycelium advances in a linear way through its hyphae. So they surge in a linear way forward, while human organs and the tissues accrue in layers. So it's layers of cell upon cell upon cell in the construction and the architecture of a human organ, of human skin. I mean, human skin is layers and layers, the dermis and the epidermis and the epithelium. So in fact, what is very interesting is the structure of us, and the structure of a mycelium is very, very different. Our structure is not a linear structure at all. It's a layered, stratified structure.
It also has, like I said, it's a homeoretic thing in the fact that it has a trajectory. It's not simply something that doesn't change. I mean, that was one of the things, and this was something, because the thing is, one of the advances, I think one of the great opportunities for architects that has been kind of missed till now has been the idea of Whitehead's idea of process, and the idea that things are process based, and metaphysically things come about to be not static but a series of kind of stable, changeable components. More kind of like the idea, like, Heraclitus talks about the idea that one never enters the same river twice, because something is constantly changing and constantly shifting. But as opposed to the kind of Platonic idea or the Parmenian idea of a kind of unchangeable substance. So I think in the opportunity is the analogy you bring up is actually quite interesting, is that just the same way that we have a series of permeable and impermeable membranes kind of close to the surface of our organs and our skin and things like that, I believe what necessary could conceivably be a benefit to kind of project the house or the building into the environment would be to have a kind of series of membranes similar to those things that exist, in terms of the way in which things cross, say, the blood-brain barrier, or kind of like, cell barriers, or kind of like protein barriers, where they have ways to get into the cell or out of the cell.
Osmotic.
Exactly. Or kind of kind of like homophobic and aspects of kind of cells.
Or hydrophilic,
Yes, exactly.
hydrophobic. I mean, there are all sorts of
Exactly.
different
Right.
ways that things
Right.
pass a barrier.
So the idea
Yeah.
of kind of like creating these barriers and being able to kind of have these things institute kind of, symbiotic relationships with organic networks, like a mycorrhizal network, as if as if the building wasn't isolated completely as buildings are right now. I mean, one of the reasons what happens is buildings have mold, buildings have condensation, buildings have all these things, but they see them as negative aspects, and they usually as a result of a failure of a system, right? A mechanistic system, not a kind of self-healing system. Now, again, you can't, we're very far away from the idea of growing systems that basically can self-heal.
It's tantalizing.
It is. But the thing is, the idea is since we have the ability to understand that we can generate condensation within mechanical systems, we could basically use that to the benefit of, say, organisms that benefit from that condensation. They could use that as kind of like hydration, or could use it as, a kind of like habitation.
Sure.
So the thing is, we see very little in the value of the byproducts of the systems that we institute in our buildings. And as a result, we've never really kind of engaged in try to kind of how to occupy them. Now, we also have domestication in the fact that we have organisms that coexist with us. We have ants and spiders and cockroaches and rats and mice and all kinds of things, and pigeons. So they
are wedded to humankind.
Exactly.
Too.
And they're very happy to coexist with us.
They are tickle pink.
Exactly. I mean, it's like one only has to go to the beach and see the seagulls. It's like, I'm not going to.
It's a smorgasbord.
They're like, why am I going to fly?
Anymore,
why am I going to fly all the way out into the water to get
risk, injury?
Exactly.
Risk
So I mean, I'm going to basically just eat out of the garbage cans. Now, again, they don't see it as a garbage can. They look at it as like
it's a smorgasbord. It's a Swedish smorgasbord.
It is. So
being, Scandinavian.
Yeah, so let's talk briefly about the diving bell house. The diving bell house is kind of like the next project I'm going to engage in.
Yeah, this is a brilliant idea.
Thank you, Pete.
Yeah, sure.
And I was thinking about today about the idea of the fact that in some of these membranes, there could be a correlation to, growing the mushrooms as a kind of component part of a permeable or semi-permeable membrane on the outside of the house. The house is basically taking a pressurized environment and pushing it into the ground. So it basically is like a diving bell spider, where it takes air bubbles from above.
You might want to explain it.
So the diving bell spider kind of takes air bubbles from above and then brings it down into the water and builds its own kind of like diving bell
where it
basically can breathe underwater. So what happens is, it's not as if
it's a bathysphere.
Yeah, it's not as if exactly. It's not as if we want to. I mean, one of the problems when you build a project underground is dealing with the water table. But the thing is, if you actually pressurized it by making it an impermeable membrane, then you basically you could push all the water out. Now, the problem is, what we do is we don't pressurize our cellars. We have, ventilation. Now, you could have ventilation as still have a pressurized container, which means you could actually open this to the bottom and you would be able to have a well inside your own house, because the well would basically be the suppression of the water table to whatever level you wanted, right? Because what happens is the water table is at 4 feet, but if my building is at 20 feet, right, the water would rush in. However, if it's pressurized, it keeps the water out.
Which is
a
great idea.
By modulating the pressure, I could basically bring that well to any point within my container.
How would you modulate the pressure?
Pneumatically, hydraulically, there's many ways. I mean, it's a mechanical operation at that point. But the point is, what happens is, I can make this, I could basically make the membrane, I could even make it a static membrane, in which case it's always pressurized, or I could basically change the pressure based on my need. Exactly. I can make it an active membrane. Now, that active membrane could conceivably take aspects of this and my own habitation, let me finish, and then push this out into the adjoining soil, which could be kind of like symbiotic in terms of like, just like a nitrogen fixing root nodule basically is a symbiotic membrane kind of nexus between different components. So the reality is, my carbon dioxide, my waste products, we always look at our waste projects, our hair and our skin and thing, and think like, oh, who needs this? But the insects that basically live on it, the mites and the microbes, they love that stuff. So the idea is, if I can basically extinguish this or distribute this, right, I can basically make these things nutrient based for the soil. Now, again, when I die and when people die,
you aren't going to die.
No, I'm not. But
neither am I.
Good. So what happens is when other people die, those things become part of that process of the regeneration. So the reality is, we could bring our friends over and kill them and then use them as kind of nutrients for the soil.
That's good. Yes,
we don't have any friends, so we don't have to worry about that. Yeah.
Hard to be intense. You don't make a lot of friends. Anyway, 2 words: organic affinities. So when the mycelium is progressing, exploring, which it does, moves around constantly, is always growing, always. It isn't blindly just poking around. It has methods, it has goals, and in fact, it has organic affinities. It communicates chemically with its entire environment. It prefers certain roots over other roots. It prefers certain plants over other plants. It chooses to go in the directions it goes because it wants to get to its goal faster and more efficiently. It makes very studied, very informed, intelligent choices. It's not just seeking light and avoiding the dark or going around rocks in the soil.
Yeah, because honestly, one of the things that we've noticed is the fact that, it's funny, science had something recently about animal conscious, animal consciousness.
I brought this up at that particular architecture.
And the reality is why wasn't that obvious?
It's obvious to me.
The point is, we understand the fact that there's a certain level of conditioning that takes place. So we'll probably come back to this at other times.
Oh my God, we're almost up to an hour.
So the thing is, basically, the idea is clear that there is an aspect of the fact that the things that we are in terms of our environment can in fact have a symbiotic relationship with the soil. And as a result, it can nurture and also be part of things that are kind of part of other networks. Talked about that, and the fact that that there are trees that basically favor the relationship, the symbiotic relationship with the mycorrhizal networks. So, and again,
they allow trees to actually talk to each other below ground when they would have no connection above ground.
So the idea is the fact that these things kind of find ways to kind of mutualize.
Yeah.
So that desire for that mutualizing is something that we kind of need to kind of look for. So anyway, so that's basically it. I don't think we've totally kind of finished this yet, but I think
go to part 3.
I think I want to kind of move on to the next one, which is going to be, the kind of the idea of kind of the measurement, which is kind of so we should talk about that and come back to this.
Sure.
But I think that at this point, we've left a lot to be talked about. We've got the general idea, and maybe once we have more of kind of the aspects from the diving bell house, we could kind of maybe kind of publish some of those things and kind of show that.
And if I may address any mycologists out there, who I hope maybe some of whom are listening and tuning in, we'd love to start a conversation about this.
We have certain people we can talk to, but I think that would be something I think would be benefit. Wasn't there
she was a woman at Yale who actually studies lichens.
That's not. This was a little bit past her.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's it for now. And next week will basically be, what do we have next week? Let's see what I had. I had the title for it, and it was kind of measurements. And there's a quote that from Poincaré that I think I use as kind of beginning, and also kind of something is related to kind of Hume and the relationship between our understanding of things and what exactly is the usefulness. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all of us to maintain that. Thank you.
Thank you.